Now, if there was one verse that could sum up the Gospel of Mark, then it might just be Mark 10:45, where Christ famously said that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for the many. And in this video, I will obviously be explaining why Mark 10:45 is such a key verse. Now, without going into the weeds too much, it's important for us to ask, well, the obvious, who was Mark? Church tradition says that he was John Mark, who's mentioned numerous times in the New Testament, most notably for causing the rift, ending the working relationship between Paul and Barnabas. Mark, or John Mark, was Barnabas's cousin. And when Paul and Barnabas went on their first missionary journey, Acts 13, they brought along John Mark, I guess, as a helper, as a for logistical support. But for whatever reason, sometime during that missionary journey, he ditched, he bailed, he abandoned Paul and Barnabas and went back home to Jerusalem. And it obviously caused a lot of hardship, because after Paul and Barnabas returned, and then when they decided that they'd like to go back and revisit and encourage these new churches that they had planted, Barnabas, I guess he wanted to give John Mark a second chance, but Paul was like, whoa, no, not a wise idea. The dispute was so intense that Paul and Barnabas decided to part ways. And Barnabas took John Mark, sailed off to Cyprus to do mission work there, and Paul took another young man by the name of Silas. And of course, we would all like to know who was right, Paul or Barnabas, but Scripture does not tell us that. The good news is that later on, we can tell in Paul's writings that he and John Mark reconciled, and that Paul considered John Mark faithful, a good, dependable co-worker. Another noteworthy thing is that according to church tradition, John Mark became quite closely associated with Peter, the disciple of Christ, and spent a lot of time with Peter in Rome. Peter's letter, 1 Peter, at the end, he refers to Mark as his beloved son. Peter would have told Mark all kinds of stories about Jesus, his teachings, the parables. And as a result, Mark put all that down into writing, and thus we have the Gospel of Mark. Another noteworthy thing is that Mark wrote this gospel to Gentiles. And it's important to realize this, that he was writing this to Gentiles, primarily to Romans, because the Romans, they had a very straightforward mindset, and we can see this in the gospel. Jesus is presented as a man of action, a man of authority, a man who, the Son of God, whom the demons feared. And so we come now, of course, to Mark 10:45, the key verse of Mark. And this comes at the tail end of another famous story that begins in Mark 10:35. It's when James and John, who would later write the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the two brothers, they approached Jesus and they said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." I mean, the gall, imagine that, coming up to Christ and saying, "We want you to do whatever we ask you." And their request was that when Christ established his kingdom, who they thought was going to be this big earthly superpower, that they wanted to be the two top officials. What's key in this story is that the other 10 disciples didn't know about this. They did this in secret. But then somehow the other 10 found out and were very angry, probably because they didn't think of that, they didn't try doing that first. And so Jesus decided to use this as a teachable moment. And Jesus called to them and said to them, "You know that those who were considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for the many." If there was anyone who deserved to be served, it would be Christ, the Son of God, God in human form. And yet he chose instead to serve and to give his life as a ransom for the many. This whole idea of who is the greatest, Well, it conflicts with our modern ideas, but especially back in those days to the Roman mindset where everything was about glory. About 100 years prior, you had Julius Caesar, who led his armies through Gaul, killed hundreds of thousands of people, enslaved hundreds of thousands of people. Why? It was for glory. And to the Roman mindset, people thought actually that was great. I mean, we're revolted by that idea today. But back then, that was a sign of a true leader. That was a man of authority. Yet Christ was deliberately saying, no, that is not how his kingdom operates. And that's something how we need to keep in mind today. Whoever wants to be the greatest must be the least. This Puritan prayer, I think, really sums up the mindset that we should have. It says, "Thou hast brought me to the valley of vision, where I live in the depths, but see thee in the heights, hemmed in by mountains of sin, I behold thy glory. Let me learn by paradox that the way down is the way up, that to be low is to be high, that the broken heart is a healed heart, that the contrite spirit is a rejoicing spirit, that the repenting soul is a victorious soul, that to have nothing is to possess all, that to bear the cross is to wear the crown, that to give is to receive, that the valley is the place of vision." And may we have that same attitude. Now, if you haven't already, the Gospel of Mark, we looked at that a few weeks ago, and it'll be somewhere over here. Thanks so much. Please subscribe, and I'll see you next time.